Thanks for joining us on the Sport Chippers YouTube page. My first guest couldn't really be anybody else, could it? Somebody I worked with and became a friend over 20 years while we travelled the country covering Nottingham Forest. You'll hear from Colin Fray talking about his favourite games, his favourite derby games, and how he started. His first game was something pretty special, covering Nottingham Forest. Don't forget to subscribe. You'll see the second part of this interview in a few days. If you subscribe, it'll come up on your YouTube feed. We'll chat with Colin Fray about covering Nottingham Forest next. Well, Colin Fray, thank you for joining us. It's been a while. Have you been missing me?
Yeah, I mean, everyth's been completely normal since you left. Nothing's changed at all.
I think the whole country's gone off the rails.
Absolutely smooth. Yeah.
Really appreciate you doing this. We've obviously kept in touch over the last 18 months or so, but face to face, good to have a chat. I want to talk really about your career, really, and where it all started. I mean, we worked together for what, 20 odd years, but you have gone on longer than I could manage, and you started well before I did as well. Do you still remember the first game?
Very much so, yeah. I remember the first game I did for radio, which was at Hinckley Athletic in the FA bars, doing the full-time report from my phone box on the way back because we couldn't get a signal out the radio car. And I remember the very first Forest game, but you can't really forget a 7-0 win over Chelsea, especially these days, because 7-0 wins over Chelsea seem a long way off. But yeah, that was my first game. Got a phone call on I think it was only the Friday before, from Martin, who was the sports editor, said, "Do you fancy doing Forest tomorrow against Chelsea in the First Division?" All right, yes, please.
And was that the whole game? Was that commentary, or how did it work?
No, it was that was in the days when we did commentary on the away team. Now, of course, we did commentary on both teams, Forest and Notts County, but it was the away team that got commentary those days. So there was no commentary. Unbelievably, Forest. You think about that these days. Forest against Chelsea in the top flight, and no commentary on the radio because second half commentary, which is all we had, was on Notts County, and you'll have to forgive me, I can't remember exactly where they were that day, but the second half commentary was on Notts County that day, so there was a bit of a quiz going on during the first half, and
it's mad, isn't it? It's a sign of how things have changed, isn't it? How long ago was that? 30 years ago?
So that was 30. Yeah, it was 1991. So yeah, exactly 30 years ago. So yeah, I mean, as I say, the idea of local radio not doing commentary on a first division match of a club in your patch. I mean, that is the case in some places because of rights issues and stuff like that. But you know, if you've got the rights but don't do it, that these days seems, you know, a completely alien concept. So, but yeah, that was only 30 years ago. That was the way it was, and there was one.
That's a Premier League match. You talk about first division, but obviously, effectively now that is Premier League.
That's a Premier League match, yeah. And you know, to add to that, it's not only local radio, but national radio, who, again, forgive me, I can't exactly remember whether it was still the days of Radio 2 or Radio 5 or Radio 5 Live, but the national broadcaster.
Probably the home service.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for that. They didn't have a reporter there. So there was nobody there for national radio. So that led to me, because it was such an extraordinary scoreline with the 7-0 scoreline. That led to me on my first day for local radio also being on Sports Report on national radio as well, doing a report at the end. So the idea that there was no commentary on the game and national radio weren't even sending a reporter to what these days would be a Premier League game. I mean, it was basically 2 seasons before the Premier League started. So. And there was that sort of lack of coverage. It is extraordinary to think now, when you consider how many media are at any top flight match, any Premier League match from all over the world. The idea that even the home nation's broadcaster wasn't, you know, never even sent a reporter to do 30-second reports on it. So yeah, times have changed a little bit.
And did it help that it was 7-0, that you obviously had loads to talk about? I mean, 7-0 obviously is an extraordinary scoreline at any time, but around that time it didn't seem out of the norm necessarily for Forest that they would win well and win well at home. But you know, when you look back, did it help you in your first game that it was 7-0?
I'm sure it did, yeah. And the following Wednesday night, I was working for Radio Norfolk. Actually, they hired me because it was in the days when before I started working full time for Radio Nottingham, and I was sort of freelancing around, but still had another job. Radio Norfolk hired me to do Norwich at the City Ground, and Forest won 5-0 that night. So it was it was quite a start. But yes, I think that's right. That when if you've got something to talk about, and in the case of it being that day, sort of wax lyrical about, you've got a sound base to be starting from, rather than having to try and dredge up words on a dull, boring 0-0.
Which you do very professionally these days, I should.
Well, I've had plenty of practice, Robin. Thank you very much for that.
When you were growing up and listening to the radio, I presume, or the television, who were the people you admired? Who were the people you wanted to be?
Well, the guy I really wanted to be was Peter Jones. He
Right.
was, to me, the doyen of broadcasting. Sadly passed away doing what he loved, covering the boat race. But the voice for me of football growing up, lovely, rich, deep voice, and flowery lines and lyrics that he could come up with to describe any situation. And I just loved his voice. I fell in love with the way he did commentary. Sort of in the early days, styled myself a little bit on him, because he was my hero. He was the one I wanted to be, and thought, well, that's how you've got to be. I think over the years you kind of find your own style, but in those early days, you sort of have to, I think, kind of try and base yourself on somebody, and he was the best as far as I was concerned. And so that's what I tried to do. I tried to style myself on him a little bit. I think telly-wise, Barry Davis was always the king of TV commentary for me.
You're a Davis man, not a Motson man.
I'm definitely a Davis man, not a Motson man. No offence, John. Sorry, but again,
so Brexit, you had to choose one, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you couldn't like both. But again, I'm just a fan of the style, really, and just the sort of in Barry Davis's case, the sort of almost relaxed way that he seemed to deliver stuff. But again, those, the magic lines that he could come up with, in the same way as Peter Jones did on the radio, the wondrously descriptive lines that just capture a moment. Both of those for me, but primarily because I was radio and always have been, really. I've never really been a TV person. I've always been a radio person, and Peter was definitely the king for me.
Going back to 91, how different was it as somebody in the media covering Forest? And I appreciate in 91 it was obviously very early for you, but in terms of a match day experience, you've already touched on it wasn't even a game with commentary on it, let alone a presenter there, obviously, which I did for a while, and interviews and that sort of thing. How different was it then to what Radio Nottingham does now?
I mean, completely different. Absolutely, completely different. Slightly, I suppose there were more similarities when we were doing a commentary match. So when Forest were away, and they were the away team then, things were a little bit more akin to kind of how we would know it now, really, in that the presentation came from the ground, albeit that we haven't been able to do that for a long time because of COVID. Hopefully getting back to that very soon. So the presentation sort of came from the ground, but even in those days, if we were doing commentary, there were two commentators, but we didn't have a summariser. There wasn't like an expert former player alongside us like we have these days. So the commentary team kind of did stuff between them. In those days, because it was, largely, I suppose, because Buffy was still in charge, there wasn't such a thing as a post-match interview. They just didn't exist.
That was my next question.
No, there was
Did he used to come out at 5:10 and talk to the local media?
Just hold court on the touchline. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for hours, because he loved doing that. No, there was none of that. There was no interview. And the thing is, there was no contract. The managers in those days weren't contracted to do any post-match interviews or any post-match press or anything like that. So they didn't. Particularly in the case of Buffy, he didn't anyway. And notoriously, he very rarely let his players speak. I do remember my first interview being with Lee Glover, sitting in his car, actually, in the City Ground car park after a game. And I forget which game it was. It wasn't the 7-0, or it wasn't one of the very first games I did. But I did. He was the first kind of post-match player interview that I managed to get. But they in those days they were very, very rare. There was no. I suppose it's a strange thing, really. There was no expectation. There was no expectation from either the governing bodies, whether that be, I suppose it was still EFL then, before the FA Premier League breakaway. There was no expectation or demand from the governing body. There was kind of no real demand from the media, really. It was sort of, if you get it, then great. Thank you very much for your time, and that's a real bonus for us. Thank you. And similarly, therefore, because it never happened, there was never an expectation from listeners, viewers, supporters that it would happen. And nowadays it's very much there is an expectation, a demand that you hear from the manager and hopefully players after a game. And obviously they are now contracted to talk after a game as well. And the supporters have come to expect it, but all very, very different. And only going back those 30 years. So although we had the technology, we had the kit there, and we were able to do it, it was just something that in those days wasn't done, and has evolved over the course of, I suppose, fairly soon after.
Premier League, I suppose, when that came in.
Yeah, probably Premier League. Although I remember even, it would have been Premier League time. I guess probably from a Forest point of view, once Cloughie had retired and Frank Clark came in, I do remember quite regularly interviewing Frank Clark post-match and the Forest players in those days as well. So that would only have been a couple of years later, 93, 94, that sort of thing started to happen. And so you're probably right, with the advent of the Premier League and all the media attention that was on it, I guess that's when things started to really change.
I can ask you a question that I'm sure you've been asked dozens and hundreds of times, but as you know, with working with me for 20 years, that never stopped me. What's been your favourite Forest game to commentate on?
The thing about the last 30 years covering Forest is, if we're absolutely honest.
Yeah, it's not been unbridled success, no? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Many highlights, have there?
No.
Let's be honest. So they're fairly slim pickings. I loved in the early days, the couple of years of Premier League that Forest did manage to give us were great, going around to those grounds and then finishing third under Frank Clark and going into Europe the next year. That was, superb. Following them around Europe, there were some great memories in that. But I think probably the favourite game has to be the day they got promoted against Yeovil at the City Ground. But we're talking then getting promoted from the third tier, from the third division, League One as we know it now, back into the Championship, which shows you how bad it had become. That they'd had to spend 3 years in League One and trying desperately to get out of League One after relegation from the Championship, and that, I suppose, kind of signifies the dearth really over the last 25-30 years 25 years, I suppose, of real success for Forest. That actually, probably, when you're looking at a highlight for me, it would be the day they actually won something, which is promotion, albeit promotion out of the third tier. But it was a great day. It was a lovely sunny day. There was obviously the drama of another game going on that we had to keep across. And, I've told the story many times of having to relay the scores from the other game between Doncaster and Cheltenham. And when I did give that score out, the City Ground cheering, and it kind of felt like the most like the nearest I would ever get to scoring a goal for Forest, because as soon as I said that, the whole place erupted because the scoreline elsewhere was going in Forest's favour. But Julian Bennett's great goal, the post-match celebrations, you were obviously on the pitch going around with them afterwards. It was just it was a fantastic day. It was
more about the occasion than the match, and it was an event, wasn't it? Really,
it was an event, and the thing is, a month earlier, nobody had expected it. Everybody had thought that Forest were done and they were finished, and then they had a really strong end to the season. I remember after the game against Doncaster, when they lost, that probably about a month before, they lost at Doncaster, and kind of everybody was writing it off. And Colin Calderwood afterwards said, "No, nothing's done yet." then they came with a really good finish towards the end of the season, and ended up getting up on the final day. So yeah, I think sort of everything about that day really is one that really sticks in the mind. So, and there've been others. There've been great moments. You know, you look at some of the Derby days and the Derby moments and things like that have been very memorable. But I think as a whole package, as a favourite game, as a favourite day, favourite occasion, it has to be that, I think.
I was going to suggest the Derby games. I thought you were going to talk about maybe the 5-2, because that obviously lives long in the memory, and obviously the nice quirk at the end about 5-2 and the A52 and that kind of thing. Everything kind of, it just felt like it was going to be a great night. Forest going into that game were in terrific form, Derby in abject form at the time, and they lived up to expectations that particular evening. What do you remember of that night?
Yeah, great night, and there's something great about Derby nights that are nights rather than days. You know, I hate the lunchtime kickoffs that they constantly give us these days for Forest and Derby, because it does. I'm sorry, it detracts from the occasion. I just think it does, and I think that I think probably the days of kicking off at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon are gone for that particular match. But stick it on a Friday night. Stick it under the lights. 7:45 Friday night under the lights. The atmosphere is increased even more than it normally is. And that was a night game. I think it was a Wednesday night, actually, wasn't it? Between Christmas and New Year. And the atmosphere was, as you've said, the atmosphere was electric right from the start, from before kickoff. Then Forest got the early goal, and as so often happened in those Derby matches in those days, there was an early goal in it. There was some sort of early drama, but there was an early goal. Great for Forest to get off on the front foot, and then, as you say, that was a Derby match where the form book did not go out of the window. The form book very firmly stayed in the room, and and just a great night. And Rob Earnshaw against his old club, capping it off by getting the fifth, which we then turned as a radio station into a ringtone that people could use as well, the commentary of it. So yeah, it was all fun. Of course, it's gone the other way as well occasionally at their place.
Yeah.
But you've got to enjoy those moments when they happen, for sure.
And when you're commentating on it, how much, I'm thinking perhaps of, the Derby go home with tails firmly between legs commentary, which, as I mentioned on an earlier video, was almost woolly legs, and I so wish it had been firmly between woolly legs. That would have been magnificent. How much of that is in your mind, if not written down? How much of it is in your mind beforehand, and how much is of the moment?
Very, very little is thought of beforehand. I think the best commentary is spontaneous, and that's what it is. I do. Some commentators do, and I wouldn't criticise it. If it works for them, then fine. I never ever script lines. I just find that if it's off the cuff, then it's sort of, yes, it's out the head, but it's from the heart as well. And I think that is kind of the best commentary. That's the most emotive commentary that you can get, because that is your phrase there, of the moment. That is entirely of the moment. It's not conceived 2 days before when you're sitting in your dining room or in the office thinking about what you might say 2 days hence. It is entirely of the moment. If you're a fan and you're at a game, you don't practice or think about what you're going to do when a goal goes in. You just do it. It is spontaneous. It's of the moment. The limbs go everywhere. You're not thinking, oh yeah, they've scored, so 2 days ago I thought I would do this, so that's what I'll do now. And I think it's very similar in commentary. I just think if you have a scripted line and you try and force it in, then it very much sounds like that. I think commentary that is spontaneous and comes from the heart and is like a fan, if you like, is, for me, that's the way to do it. That's, other people have other ideas, and I'm not for 1 minute saying I'm right, but that's the way I approach it. So I have never yet, in terms of a line in commentary, I have never scripted a single line for commentary. You have to write
You've got research
and things like that.
Yeah.
And you have research and things like that. If you're doing a preview report ahead of the match, then you'd script that for sure. That's not all off the cuff. but you know, and I know some people, when they start a commentary, you know, when a presenter hands over to them, they have their first few lines scripted out and stuff like that. I mean, it works for some people. That's not something that I tend to do either. I just think a commentary, like a match and like a fan's reaction to the match, is just spontaneous. None of it's planned out. You can't plan for what's going to happen in a football match, and for me, you can't plan for what's going to happen in a commentary.
I'm going to pay you a compliment here, which is generally against. I know it's against the way I operate, but you've got to have a certain amount of confidence and ability to be able to do that, to have that. And obviously you've done it for years, but at the beginning, were you the same? Did you have the same thought process and same way of operating, and you just relied on your ability and presumably confidence to have that moment?
It was never something I thought about, if I'm honest. I don't know if it was down to confidence or what. But it never really crossed my mind to script anything. I suppose in the very first days, when, like we spoke about for the Chelsea game, it wasn't a commentary match. We were doing what you call off-air commentary. So the goals for that game exist in our Radio Nottingham archive, and I cringe every time they come out because I really see them again. Try to sound like Peter Jones. And so they exist. They're in the archive because we do commentary. You know, sort of, it's what we call off-air commentary. So it's just recorded onto a tape in the studio for posterity, really. So it's not a live commentary, but it's being recorded, and you sort of pick up when they get 30 yards from goal or something, and something might happen, and then you start commentating. So although there was commentary in those days, a lot of what that job entailed that day was to do reporting. So to do a 30-second report on the game, to do a preview report. Now that preview report would very much have been scripted, but after that, no, it was just very much a question of relying on something coming into your mind to be able to say down the microphone when Martin crossed you and said, "Here's the latest on Forest Chelsea with Colin Fray." And it's just, as I say, it never really crossed my mind that. Probably never, I mean, we're talking 30 years ago, it was a long time ago to try and remember, but it probably never even crossed my mind that that was a thing you could do.
Right.
For me, it was live broadcasting. So, just off you go. You've got a mic and you've got a game happening in front of you. So talk about what's happening out there rather than write stuff down. So again, when you get to sort of full time and you're scripting you're scripting what they call in the business a considered report for sort of 10 past 5 or 5 past 5 or whatever. That's a bit different. Again, then you would script it because you want to make sure that you're telling the story of the game. You don't miss anything out. But also you've got a very strict time limit of how long those pieces should be, which can vary between 30 seconds and 3.5 minutes, depending who you are.
Is that a dig at me? Sorry, I'm a bit confused now.
So those were scripted, but never in commentary. Right from the start. And still to this day, that's something that I adhere to very much.
Great chatting with Colin Fray once again, albeit from this side of the world. Fantastic memories as well. Don't forget, this is only part 1. Part 2 will be on the way very soon. If you subscribe on YouTube, you'll see that pop up in your feed. But for the time being, goodbye.